Hello, and welcome to Developing with Purpose, a look at the pillars behind Pistol Whip VR. I'm Cameron Oltmann, gameplay lead at Cloudhead Games. I entered the VR development space in 2016, about the time the HTC Vive was making its debut in the world, and my favorite pastime is thinking too much about pretty much everything. The center of all of this is going to be the creation of Pistol Whip, the choices we made during the process of bringing it into being, the things that we did, what took us from, oh crap, what do we do now, to a shipped game in a little under a year. Now, the circumstances and needs surrounding each project are different, but the basic strategies that I'm going to talk about here today, I believe, are broadly applicable and can be adapted to be useful in a lot of situations. So the strategy we used consisted of 5 main points or steps. The first one is identify constraints and requirements. Basically, what are the realities that you're going to be developing under? Then from that point, you find something that matches those constraints. Then when you have a match, you test your assumptions and identify the risks associated with it. This involves a bunch of experimentation and being wrong and being mindful of what happens when you're wrong about stuff and figuring out how to correct those mistaken assumptions. Taking all of that and distilling it down into a set of pillars that you use to guide the main body of development through most of the process, and then building it. And when building, you continue to test everything against your pillars as you go. And if you find a thing doesn't fit, you cut it or adapt it until it does fit. And if something new that wasn't part of the initial plan does fit beautifully and works within your constraints, then you add it. And through this adaptive process of mindful evolution, by the time you get to the end, you have something that hopefully meets your initial constraints, comes in at the time and place that you want it to, and is awesome because you're awesome. So let's look at some of these things in some more detail and the role they played and continue to play in the creation of Pistol Whip. So first, what's a Pistol Whip? I'm glad you asked. Pistol Whip is what you'd call a rhythmic shooter. We released it in November of 2019, and since that point, we've been continuing to build it. It's continuing to evolve, and you'll see in the pictures on the right here, you can see signs of the evolution of Pistol Whip as it goes. With each update, we've added new things, new gameplay elements, new experiences, new themes, stuff like that, but we've made sure with each thing that we add that it's true to our original pillars and true to the core identity of Pistol Whip. There's variety, but it's still the same thing underneath. So how did we get here? So let's start with some context. It's early 2019. We've just shipped Aperture Hand Lab. Our next project is all lined up and ready to go. But when we get ready to start work on it, we realize that due to the way the market's changed since that plan was made, it no longer makes sense. And that project doesn't have a place in the world. So we're going to need to do something else. But what? So we start by identifying our constraints and requirements. So it's 2019. The user base in the VR landscape is really small. There's not a huge active user base. And from everything that we can see, it looks like the market can only support games with a short dev cycle, less than a year. But there is hope on the horizon. We know that it's not going to stay this way. Oculus Quest is coming. The problems that it solves from a user adoption and friction standpoint are going to make a huge difference. We know this is going to be a pivotal moment in the evolution of VR, and that there's going to be a lot of change over the next couple of years afterwards, and the market 2 years after release is going to be very, very different from the market at release. It's going to be much larger with different needs. So we also know that whatever we do next has to be something that appeals to a large part of the VR user base because the market's small. So we need a lot of it. We can't do anything niche. And it's also going to have to be cross-platform, again, because the market is small. So we're going to need to capitalize on as many different parts of it as possible. So this means PC, standalone, console, that stuff, all of it. We're also going to have to ship soon, the end of the year at the latest. This is largely production budget, market size stuff. But there's also that whole thing of being early in a new market, being a strong advantage, and we knew the Quest was going to be a big deal, so we wanted to be very early in its market. We wanted to be there from as close to the beginning as possible. But on top of all this, we also need to be relevant years after launch, because remember, the user base is going to be much larger 2, 3, 5 years down the road than it is at launch, and we want to make sure that we're still relevant at that point, that people are still playing the game, that we're still working on it, that we're still able to build it. But most important, more important than all of these really, is that it had to be something that we loved, that we'd be happy to make and keep making for years. Yeah, we have to eat, but we're in VR because we love it and we want to make cool things. So we took all these things and distilled them down into a set of project requirements based on how they'd affect us. So with Quest, we knew a lot of our players would be new to VR or even new to gaming as a whole. So we needed to build something that was going to be quick to grasp, intuitive and easy to understand, that didn't rely on pre-existing gamer knowledge or existing familiarity with VR as a whole. We couldn't require mastery right out of the gate. Couldn't do something where the player would have to learn a bunch of esoteric skills in order to be able to participate, although we could certainly encourage and enable mastery down the road. And we also knew that the player base for whatever we created would be very different. Remember, Quest is a new thing, and we knew that it was going to attract a different kind of person, a different kind of player, and those people would have a more diverse set of needs and life circumstances than the PC market that we dealt with before. Not everyone was going to have hours at a stretch to play games. So this underscored to us the importance of a low friction experience that was going to be playable in small chunks, quick and easy to pick up and put down. We'd have to build around a short play cycle. And also, again, most of our player base wouldn't exist yet as VR players, so we needed to keep building it so they'd still be playing it 2, 3, 5 years later. And none of this sounds like anything we've built before. At this point, we're a studio that's made pretty much exclusively narrative and adventure content, the kind of title that requires like a large investment of time and mental energy from our players, also kind of a niche thing, and we need to make something really different. So we've identified our constraints and requirements. So now it was time to find something that matches. So we started with a blank slate. Everything's on the table. The whole team goes into brainstorming mode. We toss around a whole bunch of ideas. We dig through a bunch of old prototypes. We come up with some absolutely ridiculous concepts, stuff from pretty much every genre. We're willing to consider pretty much everything at this point. The only things that'll get something a hard pass right off the bat is if it violates any of the requirements that we've set down. Is it too complicated? Cut. Is it lame? Do we not love it? Cut. And this underscores the importance of knowing what's important as soon as possible, knowing what matters. This is what allowed us to think up and sift through a whole bunch of different concepts in a really short amount of time and allow us to spend our time and energy on the things that had a chance of actually working. So throughout all of this, two main ideas stood out to us. The first was rhythm games. They matched our needs in a lot of ways. They have short play sessions, simple and engaging. They're easy to pick up, fun right off the bat. There's a small core loop to build around, but they also encourage mastery, and they're very replayable for a bunch of reasons. Mastery, leaderboard, score chasing, social experience, competition. We weren't really sure, did we want to dedicate the next several years of our lives to a rhythm game? I mean, they're fun to play and all, but with several years of our lives here. But there was enough here to keep it on the table. The second thing that was really compelling for us was shooters. Cloudhead Games as a studio, we all really love story, but there's also a lot of us that love action movies and shooters. And shooting's really fun in VR. There were some excellent examples of fun shooters with a simple core loop. But again, there were a couple of problems here. We didn't know if we could make something simple that was still going to be compelling over a long time frame, given the short development cycle that we would have for it. But what if we made a rhythm shooter? We latched onto this combo pretty early. We love the idea of mixing music and shooting in a fun way, like peanut butter and chocolate, sort of the Reese's peanut butter cups of VR. And we drew inspiration for this from a lot of different sources, VR and otherwise. On the rhythm game side, there's things like Rock Band, Beat Saber, DDR. On the shooter side, we had Super Hot, Compound, classic light gun games like Time Crisis even. And from movies, there was just tons of inspirational material, everything from Equilibrium, Hardcore Henry, The Matrix, John Wick. We solved it. We've got something, we're ready to go. This is what we want to build. So now it's time to test our assumptions and identify risks. So during early exploration, we experimented with simple musical shooting experiences. We started with the obvious. We took a rhythm game structure. You play music, lay down a rhythmic series of cues, tell the player what to do and when, you replace the guitars and dancing with guns and enemies, and you're done. That's easy. Ship it. Nothing's that easy. So in the process of testing assumptions and identifying risks, these were the problems that we surfaced. The first one was visual language. Most rhythm games use a literal line that's crossed by notes or targets, and that's what tells you when to act and how, and in this case, when to shoot. Finding a clear visual language for this would be tricky, but we were confident that we could do it. Another issue was shooting is hard. Shooting in VR is fun, but it's also really demanding, and actually hitting targets is really difficult. We wanted anyone who picked up a controller to be able to play and feel good right away, so this was going to be tricky. But again, we were confident that we could solve it. Locomotion was another significant issue. Locomotion in VR is a complicated thing, and we didn't want to burden the player with having to learn complicated control schemes, never mind the comfort issues. So ideally, actions in here would be as simple as possible from an accessibility and friction standpoint. So fairly early on, we actually settled on locomotion being entirely out of the player's hands, so they really didn't have to learn it at all. It would take time to nail down how to do that in a meaningful and effective way, but we were confident that it was solvable too. The last major issue that we had here was player rebellion. We'd envisioned this carefully choreographed ballet of death that we would lead our players through. We'd tell them exactly who to kill when and how, and it would be awesome. We had to nail down the design language so they could tell exactly what they were supposed to do, but that was solvable and we were getting there. But throughout the process of iterating on this, we kept getting this piece of feedback. They didn't want to follow our careful script. They wanted to do their own thing. This told us something really important. One of our core assumptions was incorrect. We had just assumed that we'd be inheriting every element of rhythm games, including dictating the player's actions in this choreography that they were supposed to follow. But our feedback showed us that wasn't going to work. We'd have to do something different. We had no idea how we'd solve this one. How do you create a rhythm game without rhythm? But we knew we were onto something, and we were confident we could do it. And game dev's nothing but a series of how do I do this anyways, so we're ready. So it was time for pillars. So based on the previous work that we've done, identifying our constraints and requirements, testing our initial assumptions, figuring out the risks associated with it, we created these pillars that we'd test any new concept against. Every game element would be tested against these things. And if it didn't hold up, no matter how cool it was, it wouldn't go into the game. So the first pillar is accessible as fuck. Fun on the first play. Dodge bullets, kill bad guys, you're Neo or John Wick, even if you've never held a gun before. We wanted players to feel comfortable and badass from the moment they jumped in, without having to learn anything much up front, ideally nothing. So we did our best to rely on things that basically everybody knew from real life, Hollywood, or other games. Our second pillar is looks fun, feels cool, and we wanted to make sure this applied to casual as well as top scoring play. So in addition to making something that felt super fun and cool to play, we wanted to make it obvious for anyone watching you that you're having an absolute blast. So we focused on elements that encourage spontaneous, high energy movement. The third one here, we have multiple paths to top scores or player expression, or as we call it now, play how you want. This one's still guiding development, but you'll see the player rebellion that we had in our previous stage is the inciting element to this, and that it dramatically affected our development and continues to this day. Our fourth pillar is forward momentum, kinetic energy, and physical activity at all times. VR is really physical as a medium, and we wanted to lean into that really hard. So we wanted everything to be more like an action movie trailer than the action movie itself. Constant momentum, no slow bits, this expressive action of a shooter, all carefully matched to the pacing of the music. And finally, action movie badass feel. We wanted players to feel badass, whether it's their first play or their 100th. And as you'll see here, there's some interrelation between these here. The way that we thought of accessible as fuck, fun on the first play, plays into, that action movie badass feel, all this kind of stuff. There's a bunch of synergy between these. In addition to the 5 formal pillars, we have these 2 other implicit pillars. You'll recognize from the constraints and requirements stage, these actually predate the pillars, and they also influenced every decision that we made through development. So first we have a multi-platform, ship everywhere, be a great experience everywhere. We knew from the start that being present on every viable platform was going to be key. Part of this was making sure that the game was a great experience on all shipped platforms. Everything important in the game had to work well on all platforms. No crappy console port energy allowed. This meant any mechanic or idea that wasn't viable on one of our platforms just did not belong in the game. In practice, this meant stuff like no fancy lighting or PBR materials, no high poly environments. If you know our previous work at all, you know this one hurt quite a bit. Our previous games like The Gallery relied heavily on dynamic lighting to set the mood, and it just wasn't possible on Quest or PSVR, so this one had to go. Another thing this meant was no 360-degree gameplay. Some of our target platforms had basically non-existent support of 360 movement, so we had to make sure that we built something that was absolutely awesome without ever making you turn around. It's worth noting here that this isn't just a matter of picking a single platform to design for. Each platform had its own strengths and weaknesses. Quest, for example, was the most constrained from a pure horsepower standpoint. It gave us the most from a freedom of movement and physical expression standpoint. So it was really a matter of distilling down the things that we could rely on across all of these platforms to make an amazing experience. So that was the first one. The second one here is ship this year. We had to keep it simple. Everything we did would have to be efficient. If something wasn't going to work, we had to figure that out as soon as possible, cut it and never look back. Well, maybe we looked back a little or pushed a few things to future updates. Having not at launch, but maybe later as an option made letting go of a few things easier. So we've identified our pillars. Now it's time to build it. This is simultaneously the easiest and the hardest part. We've already identified several problems. Shooting isn't very accessible, strict rhythm game mechanics don't allow for adequate player expression, and we don't have a viable locomotion solution in place. So let's see what we can do to solve those. So let's solve shooting first. It's the thing you're going to be doing most for the whole game. Shooting feels awkward for a lot of people and requires skills that new players often don't have. So this was a key issue, but the solution here was actually pretty simple once we step back a bit. Instead of doing what most VR shooters do and requiring you to master a tool to perform a precise action, we did the same thing that we did in Aperture Hand Lab when it came to the robot interactions. We interpret your actions and guess what you mean to do. If you're aimed mostly at an enemy and you pull the trigger, you probably mean to shoot that enemy. If you're aimed kind of between two enemies and one of them's closer, you probably mean to shoot the closer one. So we make it happen. We don't require you to master a specific skill in order to succeed. We just let you use the skills you already have, and we do our best to make your actions give you the result you want. So now you feel like a badass action hero, Pillar 5, right out of the gate, Pillar 1. And we leave the mastering a skill part for later when you decide you want to improve. The second thing related to shooting is player expression. So being told exactly what to shoot when didn't feel good. So we wanted to be able to give you the freedom to act when and how you want. The solution here was pretty simple too, actually. We removed any of the timing requirements from level completion. There was no way to fail based purely on not shooting the right guys at the right time or anything like that. You would succeed or fail based solely on the action movie or shooter elements. Don't get hit. And killing the bad guys would make this easier, but it wasn't even required. If you wanted, you could do full pacifist and complete levels without hurting a single person. The locomotion issue was the technically most challenging here. We don't want to have you standing in one place all the time because that's boring, but we also don't want to make you responsible for locomotion, as we determined early, because we don't want the associated mental burden to be placed on the player for that, because you're going to be working hard enough just trying to stay alive. So we tried a bunch of things here. We started out with a system that involved a bunch of stationary sequences that were really brief, 15, 20 seconds, and then we'd do kind of a dash teleport to the next place, and we'd queue a bunch of these up and move you through an environment. This gave us a lot of stuff. It had a lot going for it. It gave us different environments, a cool sense of pacing. There were minimal comfort issues to solve, but they were solvable, and it was really promising. Then we tried adding a constant velocity movement segment as a trial. We built this weird hallway at the end of a John Wick-style nightclub sequence that we've been using, added a bunch of interesting openings, balconies, and intersections, and pushed the player through it at a constant velocity while enemies rushed at them out of the different openings and stuff. It merged into the whole nightclub sequence really well, and it was also surprisingly comfortable. And this brings us to one of the hardest decisions we had to make in the whole project. We loved the variety of different scene types, but they presented a few problems. There were comfort issues with the transitions. They were solvable, but they'd take time, which was in short supply. They'd also reduce accessibility somewhat, since more different locomotion elements would mean more likelihood that a player would be sensitive to one or more of them. And even if you have accessibility options, being a player's first VR experience that makes them sick isn't something we wanted to do. The biggest problem here, though, was content creation speed. We knew we still didn't know exactly what fun content for this was going to look like, and that we would have to iterate a lot. We'd have to be able to create and recreate our environments many, many, many times to be able to settle on what was going to be good and fun. And creating content for this different locomotion, all these combinations of locomotion together, was going to be really challenging and time consuming. We could create tooling to make it simpler, but again, we didn't have a lot of time, and just creating that tooling would take time. And in the end, what we had to do was simplify it down. We couldn't do it all. There just was no way to fit it into the time that we had. So we did the same thing here that we did with everything in Pistol Whip development. We found what was the most important thing. We focused on that, and we built everything else around it. So we settled on the moving at a constant rate down the hallway section. We figured that it had the most to offer, and we built a bunch of tools to make iteration on level design a lot quicker. And that combination, simplified locomotion and the design acceleration tools, was instrumental in us being able to ship with the great levels we did at release. As a side note, to this date, the main scene in Pistol Whip is still named Hallway. There were also some other things that were cool but got sacrificed. Most notable among those is we had this fun two-handed reload system in. It wasn't full on military simulation or anything like that. It was more like a silhouette of the real world interaction that you would have. It just involved kind of bringing your two hands together in this specific way. It was a lot of fun, but more complicated than the light gun style point down to reload mechanic we shipped with. It was also a little bit dangerous if you got overzealous, and we broke more than one set of controllers meshing our hands together with it. So at the end, that didn't make the cut, and we have the much simplified variant that we shipped with, which is just point up or down to reload, kind of like the old light gun games did. So basically, we just followed the pillars. Everything else in-game just grew naturally out of following the pillars, iterating on content, and trying to deliver the coolest thing we could with the time we had. With the pillars to guide us and a few smart decisions early on, we were able to make something we're all super proud of. And the end result was we did it. Now, I have a confession to make here. I've shamelessly stolen this slide and the next few from a talk my teammates Jonathan Hackett and Sarah Rowland are doing tomorrow. It's called The Art of Action. If you want to learn more about what goes into making a pistol whip level and how they make everything look absolutely amazing, I highly recommend you check it out. That'll be live tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific. So we shipped with 10 levels, each one unique, bringing its own unique environmental elements, theme, and fiction with it. The game was really well received, and we got to keep making it. This set us up to continue. We released several new scenes over the next year. This included the Heartbreaker trilogy, which was a kind of a turning point for us. It brought with it a whole new chill vibe to the game and introduced a lot more dynamic environment elements and whatnot. Then last holiday season, we found a way to add a cinematic campaign to our rhythm shooter with the launch of 2089. Like I said earlier, we love stories. 5 scenes tied together, telling a coherent sci-fi narrative, and it was all topped off with a boss fight. It was absolute madness, but we did it anyway. And this was all driven by those same pillars that brought us to initial release. And this summer we launched our second cinematic campaign, Smoke and Thunder. 5 more scenes that tell a new story, add new gameplay elements, and have an even crazier boss than last time. Smoke and Thunder also includes the style system, which for a lot of us is what truly makes good on our third pillar, play how you want. The style system is a good example of how the pillars are still guiding development today. So let's take a deeper look at how that one pillar in particular helped guide early development and still shapes things to this day. So play how you want. It affected early development in a lot of ways. I've already talked about how we identified player expression as being important early on, how this was the reason we didn't follow the classic rhythm game formula. We know that given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of every experience, especially in a competitive setting. So what dictates gameplay choices and what determines effective play was going to be really important here. And that's basically 2 things for Pistol Whip at least. So the win and loss conditions, how you succeed or fail, which is relevant from the first play, is the first thing that dictates gameplay. And the second one is scoring, whatever gives you the best score, which is much more relevant with repeat play. So nailing down the win and loss conditions was pretty straightforward. It's all pure action movie shooter elements, right? Defeat the enemies, don't get hit, don't die. Scoring was a little more nuanced though. We had some basic assumptions. From the rhythm game genre, we figured there'd probably be some kind of points for timing. And from the shooter genre, there'd be some kind of points for shooting enemies, and probably for accuracy of how you do that, and probably some kind of penalty for getting hit. And that's what we shipped with. But we did look at a lot of other things along the way. So when we'd find a gameplay activity that was fun, we'd look at whether it made sense to include it in scoring in some way. And some of the things that we looked at was reloading on beat was pretty cool, right? Like anything that encouraged the player to play along with the music. And reloading on beat turned out to be really fun early on. We tried giving points for that. And some of you are going to already know where this went. This resulted in people spamming a reload on every beat to get to the top of the boards. It effectively dictated a specific playstyle, so it was cut. Melee was also really fun. Really satisfying to just, pistol whip an enemy and see them flail off into the distance. So we figured we could try incentivizing it because it's inherently more risky in most circumstances to wait for the enemy to get that close to you because they have that much more time to shoot you and whatnot. So we looked at if there was a point in, if it would be good to reward people with extra points for that. We tried giving bonus points. But the end result of that was pretty predictable when you look at it in hindsight. If you get more points for meleeing enemies, you have to melee every enemy possible, which again dictates a specific playstyle. So that was also cut. One of the biggest parts of Play How You Want was modifiers. We created these as a way to customize the gameplay experience, and they changed the way the game feels. So this is things like dual wield, so you can play with 2 guns instead of 1. Deadeye, where you can turn off aim assist, which is not only harder, but it actually is a much different experience. Scavenger, where the only way to reload is to melee an enemy. The inspiration for Scavenger came from an action movie scene where the protagonists are outnumbered, fighting their way out of a fortress, picking weapons and ammo off their defeated enemies as they went. But modifiers weren't just ways to make the game harder. They were also ways to make it weirder, just different or easier. Bulletproof is literally you can't die. Threatless, the enemies don't shoot back. It's a much more chill experience. It's much more akin to target practice. But we identified a problem fairly early on. For each modifier, we'd adjust your score to keep things fair. Deadeye was harder, so you got a bonus. Threatless was easier, so you got a penalty. But the more modifiers we added, the more difficult it became to balance. And we knew there was no 100% fair way to do this. We could give people some options for different play styles, but not nearly as many as we wanted. So while we were happy with the experience we delivered at launch, we knew that there was still room for improvement. But that's fine, good even, because if you remember, one of our goals was to stay relevant and continue improving Pistol Whip for years. So that brings us to styles. Styles is the culmination of over a year of planning and implementation, and it exists solely to serve the pillar, play how you want. We wanted people to be able to play the game and compete in any way they wanted. You love Deadeye? You want to brawl your way through every scene? Do you wish everything was a bullet hell? We've got you. You can pick any play style and compete in a meaningful way. But how? Every scene, every style would have to be its own leaderboard. That's 2 million leaderboards or so with the number of scenes and modifiers and styles that are possible now, which is absolute madness. So this was great, but it did present a few problems. The first is fragmentation. We knew that this would end up with our players all scattered across a huge number of leaderboards. We also knew that it was going to be a bit of a challenge from a simplicity and accessibility standpoint. With so many different ways to play, we wanted to make sure that this didn't become too cumbersome for people, especially new players, to get into and understand. Remember, we want to make sure that people can just jump in and play and understand what's going on right away. We also knew there were going to be technical challenges associated with this. Leaderboard systems just aren't designed to deal with millions of leaderboards in this way. So in looking for solutions to this, the first two problems were actually solved with one thing, and that was curation. So we leave the core player experience essentially unchanged. You play the game just the way that players did at launch. Everything has a default style. And when you're ready, the styles are there for you. When you decide that you want to play differently, we have suggested and popular styles front and center, which keep things nice and simple, and also makes sure that we have a core set of leaderboards that are well populated and full of competition. And then if and when you're ready, if you decide that the highlighted popular styles just aren't quite giving you what you want, you had the ability to customize and pick a new style, choose a new crazy combination of modifiers, anything like that. This also had the benefit of giving us the possibility that players can find some of that old school arcade experience where you can find a less populated board and compete directly with your friends, have a much better chance of posting a top score in a lower play board, that kind of thing. All while still maintaining the core experience of simple, get in, play the experience that we know is going to be kick-ass, that meets the core pistol whip experience, and the players would have the ability to branch out into more diverse and interesting styles when they were ready and when they wanted to. The technical problems were a little bit more difficult, and essentially that just boiled down to buckle down and do it. We had to build tools to make that possible. And this was all possible because we planned for a long life cycle and set ourselves up for success early on. So let's recap. We used a simple strategy to define and build a cool new experience that met the real-world constraints of the VR market at the time while working within our own financial and time constraints and the realities that we faced as a studio, all while being true to ourselves and to what we loved. And that strategy was to identify our constraints and requirements nice and early, find something that would match that, test all the assumptions that were implicit in that thing, identify any associated risks, create pillars from that we could use as a guide while we continue to build and complete the creation of our game. And this worked out really well for us, and I hope that it works out really well for you too. Thank you so much for your time. If you want to learn more about Pistol Whip, please join us on Discord. We have a wonderfully supportive community there, nurtured by our awesome community manager, Ashley Blake. She did a talk yesterday called Take Control of Your Community that's chock full of insights on how to build a nurturing, positive community environment. I highly recommend you check that out. If you have any questions or you want to chat, I'm always happy to talk. Pistol Whip, VR, all things game dev. I'm on Twitter at CodeBison, or you can email me at the address on your screen if you still use email. Again, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you all have a great DevCom.